On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Where did you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he took his place with the 12, and while they were eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him, one after another, "Surely not I, Lord." And he answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." He replied, "You have said so." While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will never again drink of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." When they had sung the hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives.
Thanks, Betsy. Okay, I'd like to start by praying. God, thanks for this time. Thanks for the way that you just kind of weave this fabric of your church into a community. God, pray that you'd help us as we do our day jobs, whether that's school and sports, or if that's teaching school, or if that's a season where we're at home with kids, or whatever it is that we're up to, God, that this vision you have is remarkable, where we would get together and reflect on you and become more and more yours, be refueled by your Spirit, and then would enter back into the ordinary every day and allow you to show up through us. Also thinking of friends that are here that are just not sure where they're at anymore. And we recognize that this has been a hard season for a lot of people in their faith journey, and yet we also recognize that's in a sense normal. And so I pray that you'd be faithful to them, that their friends would continue to walk with them in a way that would represent you. And then for people here, God, that they're just here because they married someone, or they're friends with somebody, or they're intrigued and they're wondering whether or not you could help them with whatever it is they're working on. Pray that while on the one hand we work with people who have followed you for decades, that on the other you would be accessible for someone who's hearing some of your ideas for the first time. Amen. So on Tuesday morning, the first thing we do as a staff, we take Mondays off. Tuesday morning, the first thing we do is we meet and we just do review of the prior week, whether that was scattering or Sunday or both or whatever, and just highs, lows, what can we improve on? It's not, for us, it's not about perfection, but it is about improving. And then from there at 9:30, we all go back to our respective offices and kind of dig into the one or two things that this community needs us to win at. And for me, that involves getting back to my office and closing the blinds of my windows. And the first thing I do then is I sit down and I read the passage. So this last Tuesday, I would have read this passage. And then I glance over and read through my notes, because generally I've studied for this week in my own time months ago. And then on the Friday before the Tuesday, I usually block an hour where I can just sit with my Evernotes, and a lot of it's journaling type stuff, and I make a one-page summary of those notes. So I read the text, and I read those notes, and then I stand up, and I force myself out loud to answer one question. And it's this question of, what's the one thing that I want to say? I try to put it in the form of a question, like why does this passage matter? What's the one thing that matters? But I'm very, very married to this idea that we're not necessarily here to teach the Bible, though I love the Bible, but we're here to really wrestle with what it means to follow Jesus, and that means that a Sunday morning is distinct from a seminary classroom. We're not trying to exhaust everything that someone could observe from a section. I say all that because I'm fairly insecure about saying anything about the passage we just read, let alone to try to summarize it in a single 25-minute experience. If you've been around Christianity for a while, you know that this passage, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist moment, whatever it is that however it is you've referred to it in your tradition, like this is one of these stories. 2,000 years of church history kind of comes back to this point. The core of what it is that we believe and think comes back to this point. And yet there's other things. And And to be honest with you, in my own study months ago, part of what I really spent a lot of time on was Judas and the contrast between the type of person he is and yet how Christ treats him. There's also that little statement there where it says it had been better if he hadn't been born, which seems unbecoming of Jesus to say out loud, but it also speaks to this idea of we are accountable, that our lives do matter. None of those are what I want to drill down on. What I'd like to do is just ask this single question, and that is, why did Jesus have to die? Like, what did that accomplish for God ontologically? What did that accomplish in the creation? Like, why did Jesus need to do that? And we started last week by trying to note that he chose it. But then this week, I want to get into the next big question of why did he have to do it? And I understand that for many of you, you already have a very formed question around that, or a very formed answer, and I'm not here to dislodge that or necessarily change that. So some of you're there, and that's great. Others of you, you're wrestling with it. You used to have it. In fact, you probably know what you think you're supposed to say, but it doesn't resonate with you like it used to. And others of you, quite frankly, you're very new to the faith and you're really not sure. In fact, that's the big question of like, I get the whole be better thing, but what's with a God who has to die thing? What I'd like to try to do this morning is speak to that. And as arrogant as that sounds, part of what gives me the confidence to do that is that we can lean into some things. The first one is we can lean into what Jesus was leaning into. N.T. Wright, in his very important book called The Day the Revolution Began, it's in there where I heard for the first time this observation that he makes. And the observation was that when Jesus sought to explain to his followers why he had to die, he didn't write a book, he didn't give a lecture, he didn't draw a diagram, he didn't paint a picture. He framed it around a meal. But even then we can keep kind of stacking on top of that because he didn't frame it around any meal. It wasn't just a Friday night meal. It wasn't any point in the year. Like what we looked at last week makes it clear that for whatever reason, Jesus was very intentional to make sure that it all happened on a particular meal. And that meal is called Passover, a meal that often called Pascha in the East. It's a meal that commemorates something that happened way back. Many historians today will say that Passover even is today the longest continually celebrated, annually celebrated religious meal in the history of known humanity. By Jesus' day, it was over 1,000-year-old tradition. And yet today, then that makes it a 3,000-year-old tradition. Why on Passover? Well, last Easter, we spent a lot of energy on the nuances of Passover, and I referenced that podcast on the mind map if you're intrigued. Justin does a great job of managing that stream for us. But to summarize, when Jesus celebrates Passover, he's celebrating something that goes way back to the beginning of Israel's history. He's celebrating something that God asked them to celebrate every year, and that had a very particular moment attached to it. The moment when God, through Moses, rescued these people who had become slaves under a foreign power from their bondage. The core problem was slavery. The core need was freedom, and it was a need they couldn't provide for themselves. And so God, through Moses, through a series of circumstances, delivered them first into the wilderness and then into the promised land and then into everything we know about their more modern history. But by Jesus' day, what started as a celebration only of the past had become both a celebration of the past, a looking back to a God who rescued, as well as a looking ahead to a God who will once again rescue. This much is clear from their history. They were celebrating a God who would liberate them from Rome as much as they were celebrating a God who had delivered them from Egypt. There's several kind of neat nuances. One is part of the reason why they had to celebrate it in the city was because the belief was that the Messiah, when this Redeemer showed up, that he would show up at midnight on Passover. It's why certain gates around the city of Jerusalem were opened at midnight on Passover, because the belief was that's when he's showing up. So Jesus, in trying to explain what's about to happen, he centers it on this moment, this event, which obviously has something to do with his saying, that new age you're waiting for, it's about to be initiated by my death and resurrection. And yet still we haven't answered the question why, and we'll get to it. I want to look back at 26 because there's something I think important to observe here. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat." If we just stop there, Jesus is functioning in complete continuity with his tradition. Like at this point, he's done nothing but affirm his past and the belief system that he's been a part of, which raises this question, and I think for me, quite frankly, it's become a really important one. How important is the past in determining this question in the present? Or to say it even better, how much weight does how this question's been answered for 2,000 years bring to the conversation, to the moment? I think we all have to pay our fee here, and it's probably going to change over different inflections of history. I heard something from a guy named G.K. Chesterton, who's a historical theologian. He said this. He says, "Tradition is giving people in history a vote." Now, what I love about that is he's not saying they get all the votes, but he is saying, like, wait a minute. And if you think about it, lots of different sectors do this. Whatever business sector you work in, whether it's in medicine or law or computers or education, there's a certain reverence for the past, this understanding that we shouldn't actually reinvent the wheel with every new generation. We should appeal to the past. I think one of the big questions we have to ask in this cultural moment as we answer the question, why did Jesus have to die, is, so does the past get a vote? Does it mean anything? I took a historical theology class last semester at Portland Seminary, and my friend Dr. Bruner started the class, the first online lecture, by telling a story. And actually, it was such an impactful story for me. I was like, "Hey, can you send me that?" And it turns out it's a quote from a Les Parrott book, and he sent it to me. And I just want to read it because it's such a tightly told story. It says, "After a meal, a man named Jacob agreed to tell his children a story about a giant. He began softly. Once upon a time, there was a young girl who asked her father to take her to the parade. The father remembered the parade from when he was a boy and quickly agreed. On the morning of the parade, the closer they came to the parade route, the denser the crowd became. Soon the people in front of them were like a wall. So the father took his daughter and put her on his shoulders." "What happened next?" the children asked their father, Jacob. "Well," he continued, "as the parade passed, the girl would tell her father how wonderful it was. In fact, the girl began to mock those who could not see like she could. 'If only you, Father, could see what I see.' But," said Jacob, looking straight at the children, "what the girl did not notice was why she could see." Then Jacob stopped speaking. "Is that it?" a disappointed boy asked. "We thought you were going to tell us a story about a giant." Jacob replied, "I told you a story about a girl who could have been a giant." "How?" the children asked. "A giant," Jacob kindly said, "is anyone who remembers that we're all sitting on someone else's shoulders." "And what does it make us if we don't remember?" a boy asked. "A burden," Jacob answered. I think one of the first things we have to come up against, or maybe we get to come up against, is how important is the past? Listen, many of us, most of us probably, were raised within a Protestant tradition. Most of my following of Jesus years have come within a Protestant tradition, and I'm so grateful for it and proudly identify as Protestant. But there's a shadow to it. Everything has a shadow. And I wonder if on some level the shadow is that we've so defined ourselves by you and your Bible coming to your conclusions and convictions that sometimes maybe what we miss is the opportunity to go, you know what? I'm a part of this long story. I'm sitting on the shoulders of someone who's sitting on the shoulders of someone who's sitting on the shoulders of someone. And actually, I don't have to reinvent the wheel on this one. Like, I'm proudly a part of this tradition that brings with it its own insights and answers and contributions to the discussion. A friend recently sent me a podcast, and quite frankly, because of the respect I have for this friend, I was committed to listening to it, even though it's frankly probably not a podcast I would generally listen to. In the title was a guy named Derek Webb. And I know of Derek. I knew of him as a youth leader back in the day. He's this brilliant lead singer of a band named Caedmon's Call in the early 2000s. He also did a lot of singer-songwriter work under his own name. An incredible, kind of, even in his early days, controversial lyricist who wrote this brilliant music. His then wife, Sandra McCracken, I'd sat under leadership. I'd been at conferences where she led worship. Just an incredibly skilled couple. Well, the reason I wouldn't normally listen was because even within the title was this admission that this was a deconstructionist conversation with Derek Webb. Christian deconstructionism has its place. I think every generation experiences this. They apply their own language to it. I've certainly identified as a deconstructionist during probably the majority of my time in Helena. So it's not that I don't see the place or even empathize with what at times is the suffering of Christian deconstructionism. It's just, in my opinion, a conversation that's gone to a place that I just don't identify with anymore, and I'm not really convinced that all the questions are always honest questions. I wouldn't have generally listened to it. I did, and frankly, I'm glad I did. I reference it on the mind map if you want to listen to it. But here's what stood out to me. The first thing was, one of the first questions he was asked is, "Are you a Christian?" I get it. That's a loaded word. And that's more or less what he said. I don't know, more or less he said. I'm not sure, because what does that word even mean? Now, to be honest, I've played that card for the last 10 years. It's why we've used phrases like Christ follower and follower of Jesus, not Christian. Why? Because we all know there's this sense of well, who gets to define it? And are you going to understand based upon my definition or this person who you don't necessarily agree with's definition? I get what he's doing. But if I'm being honest, and I think being self-aware, where that's changed for me was this realization of wait a minute. You don't have to define it for yourself. You can. You're a free human and Protestant Christian. You can just apply your own meaning to that if you want. But what else can you do? Well, you can recognize that that's a very vetted question. People have died over the argument as to what is and isn't a Christian. What is the definition and what isn't? The early creeds were in large part these conversations around so who is and who isn't. And the good news is it's not a terribly complicated answer. Two things: the divinity of Christ and the triune God. That Jesus was in fact human and God, and that he's a part of this Trinity. Now, are there implications to that? Yes, things like the resurrection are in there. But if nothing else, acknowledging where I'm at this different spot where I'm listening to that going, you could do it that way, and I've done it that way. Or you could go, no, I'm actually very proudly a part of this long historic tradition called Christian Orthodoxy, and I'm one of them. The other thing that occurred to me as I was listening, and again, I think he handled himself, if all these conversations were handled the way he handled it, I think we'd be all the better for it. I think he was gracious and kind. It was a brilliant interview. But part of what stood out to me, the other thing, admittedly both deconstructionist and negative, part of what stood out to me was not once did he reference church history. As he's speaking to how has he made sense of what it means to be a Christian and how has he put his life back together, not once did he ever reference somebody living in an era beyond himself. Maybe there was a vague allusion to, this is normal, everybody does this. But never once did he speak to this long history of Christian tradition. I guess what I'm trying to bring to the surface here is when Jesus sought to explain why he had to die, he didn't invent something. He didn't grab his plow and just start heading off in a new direction. Before he did any of that, he centered himself in tradition. Take, eat, this meal called Passover, all a part of the historic movement of God bringing about salvation in people's lives. Of what value is tradition in answering this question? But he doesn't stop there either. Let's just keep reading. I'm going to start all over. While they were eating, Jesus took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat." And here's where he breaks with tradition. "This is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you," with tradition again. "For this is my blood of the covenant." There he breaks with it, "which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." What if our answers should somehow have permission to think fresh and new, but not in the absence of the past? Jesus does both. When Jesus says, "Take, eat, this is my body," that's bold. Because for 1,000 years, it was a lamb. It wasn't his body. When he says, "This cup is my blood," he better be right. Now you start understanding what God himself killed. That's audacious. Like, he shows up and goes, this isn't just the blood of the covenant. No, this isn't the wine of the covenant. This is my blood. And again, I think the question that I'm trying to ask is, what's the value of both? Now again, I still haven't addressed the question. What does it look like? Why did it happen? What was God accomplishing there? Well, there's a couple pretty dominant ideas. But here's what changed for me. Dr. Bruner shared with me, have you ever done a research project? I know this is self-centered, but this is one of those messages that comes a lot from a real place for me. Some of you have been around long enough to know we even did a series several years ago called Cruciform, where we began asking some of these harder questions of like, but that kind of sounds like child abuse. How is that what this all means? It's been a conversation that I can genuinely say I've been involved in and met with professors and done research on for years. And then there was this moment, and sometimes you know when you're working on a case or you're working on a problem, whether it's your marriage or your kids or something at school, there's this moment and it's like, "Da," and you could hear the angels singing. Dr. Bruner assigned us some reading from a chapter of a book called The Atonement Muddle. And in The Atonement Muddle, what the author does is tries to track through history the different ways that the question's been answered. Now, the first thing is its own confession. What she's arguing for or suggesting is there's not a single uniform answer to the question. N.T. Wright acknowledges this in his book. He argues there's not a single uniform metaphor in the scriptures. There's several of them, which is itself controversial. Some of you, if you were asked, why did Jesus have to die, you would knowingly or unknowingly reference a napkin illustration, I think first created by a guy named Bill Bright, who started Campus Crusade, which then was made even more famous by Billy Graham, and it's a brilliant illustration. We have a picture of it here. It's the famous bridge illustration. And this explanation, predicated largely on an understanding of guilt, what it says is that God is holy and just, and thus your sin puts you at odds with God, thus creating this gulf between you and God. But by his son dying for you, that son builds a bridge that actually allows you to once again have communion with God. The whole idea is essentially that God's justice and God's mercy are in conflict with one another, but by sending his son to die, his perfect son, God's need for justice is resolved, and thus God's mercy can win the day, and we can be reunited with Christ. And if that's what you believe, like, bravo, because that is very centered in Christian orthodoxy. But here would be my question. What if it's not the only answer the church has ever wrestled with? What if it's not the only answer that Scripture speaks to? What if there's major parts of church history, because of the culture in which they lived, there were other answers to this question? So what happened to me as I was reading the Atonement Muddle was my brain, I'm terrible at thinking linearly. I remember in fourth grade, I was assigned to outline the chapter of a certain science book, and I basically just rewrote the chapter because I struggled to break it down in outline, and I had way too many different indentations. I think in mind maps. I can't always see in terms of the connections, but if I just start putting on paper what I see, then oftentimes, like a CSI thing, that's actually when I learned how I think like this with CSI, was that I figured out like, oh, and I don't even watch CSI. That's how I think. So I started mind mapping this chapter in this book in order to make sense of it, and eventually I reached this point where I was like, wait a minute. So I texted my friend Jody, who's this brilliant artist, and I said, Jody, you know how when you go to a brewery, there's those mind maps of beer styles, and it kind of shows how all these different beers evolve from different places and different things? Let's create one of those around the cross and the different ways we've thought about it. So I'll do the intellectual work and get some help from friends, and then you do the artwork. And she did. And so we have, at the risk of being self-absorbed, but what I want to show you, and really just to land the thing, hence this very weird art with a very weird cross on the center. And let me just say, I tried to talk her out of making that the cross, even though it was originally my idea, but when I got it tattooed on my person, I said, let's not do that, because that makes me look like an egotist. But she was so attached to the art at that point that you trust the artist. So this is what we created. Now, Jody's a brilliant artist, but it's not just about look at our art. Here's for me what this accomplishes. There's a whole view that is roughly 1,000 years of church history, that's entire focus, represented here, its entire focus is based upon a Roman understanding of law and guilt. Augustine in particular used this. Anselm in the 1100s or in the late thousands brought this all together. The general idea is you were born guilty, that creates a problem. Jesus serves the need for justice and gets you forgiven. And let me please just say, that is at the very, very center of historic Christian orthodoxy. I'm not contesting that. But if that doesn't land with you in this season of life, if it just doesn't work for you right now, here's the even better news in my mind. There's a whole section, the first 1,100 years of church history, and especially what is today, quite frankly, Eastern Orthodoxy, that actually has a different answer. Here's one way to illustrate it. My friend Father Moses, he said this: Adam, when trying to explain to me how the West and the East sees this different, which really is to say like how both, who are both Orthodox Christians, how they both see it differently. He said, Adam, a baby born with fetal alcohol syndrome, is that baby guilty of something? I would say no. He said, I would too. But is it sick? I would say yes. He said, so would I. He said, here's how it's different. There's a major section that sees sin as guilt, and I'm not contesting that, but there's also a long tradition of seeing sin as sickness. One is about justice being served, one is about healing occurring. The major difference between East and West, best I can tell, is that very place. And what happened was in the early church, the fundamental problem was separation from God. The solution was communion with God. So the major metaphors early on were metaphors of victory. This was the dominant view for the first 1,100 years. It's called Christus Victor. Victory over what? Well, if you lived in a world where the majority of humans were slaves to somebody, and if not slaves, servants, then what would it mean that a Christ came and brought liberation, freedom? If you read the Gospels, you can't help but notice that there's spirits and gods and demigods everywhere. If you lived in that kind of world, where you constantly had to make sacrifices in order for certain people to live and certain trips to go okay, what would it mean that Christ's claim was that he defeated evil? There's these major themes of victory. The other major theme was the Catholics have this as well, the Protestants have this as well, but it's much more minor. It's what's called divinization or glorification, which doesn't mean that you get to become God, but it means that you were made to have communion with God. We explored this a little bit on Christmas Eve, that the idea and the reason why the incarnation was seen as such a big deal was because that his image had been lost. It was like an image painted on a picture and had become soiled to the extent that humans couldn't even recognize who God was anymore. And so he came as a human, this idea called recapitulation. He came as a human so that we could once again, the artist could recast the image, so that we could once again discover who God is, because God's he's not an answer, he's a person for us. And thus we would know what it means to be human. What if the answer to the question why Jesus had to die is more nuanced than most of us have been exposed to? And what if that doesn't threaten historic orthodoxy? What if it just makes sense that an event that cataclysmic couldn't be contained by a single metaphor? What if there's value there? As the band comes forward, we're going to give you a chance to receive communion and to think this through this way. But I just want to tell one more story from this end that for me captures the tension here. I have a friend, and I got his permission to share this story, who growing up, his dad did the type of work that they didn't always get to have vacations on the weekends. And so my friend took a lot of vacations with this other family. But they had a few rules in place. One was that if they were on vacation on a Sunday, they had to go to church. The second was, if they were on vacation on a Sunday and thus they were going to church, they couldn't go to a church that was anything like their home church. And third was if A and B were true, they were out of town on a Sunday and they were going to church, they couldn't go to a church that was anything like one that they had visited on any prior trip. The result, obviously, was great variety of church experience exposure. And it wasn't until my friend was in high school, or graduated high school, that the parents explained to them, here was their rationale. And I think it's prophetically genius in our current cultural moment. The rationale was, if at some point you no longer identify with your Christian tradition, the one that we've raised you in, we want you to know that there's lots of other Christian historical traditions that you ought to check out and that may serve you well. That friend says every one of those kids is like active in following Jesus today, but in a really wide variety of traditions. My observation, and it's just my own personal observation, but I have spent a lot of time with people struggling with deconstruction in these last couple of years. I have empathy for it. I think I'm a survivor of it. My observation is, in general, the people who seem to be suffering the most are those who the only thing they've known is one tradition. What I've observed and what I've tried to say out loud, and not everyone agrees with me on this, but what I've tried to help some of them see from my perspective is you think you're choosing between Jesus and no Jesus, but actually what you're choosing between is evangelicalism and no Jesus. And I don't identify as an evangelical, but I'm grateful for it. But sometimes it feels like it's for failure to understand the larger nuances of Christian orthodoxy that we're making decisions that we actually don't have to make. Many of us grew up with grandparents who, like, weddings weren't attended because of some of these issues. But what I see is my friends who it seems to be working for them better than most in this season is there's variety to their faith journey. Does that mean I'm telling you, hey, time to go find a new church? Well, I guess I am saying if that's what you need, do it, please. But more than that, what if appealing to tradition isn't a cop-out? What if it's this humble acknowledgement of, I get a vote, but so do a lot of other people? So I don't know what this means for you. It seems fitting that we're going to give you a chance to participate in communion. If you've not done that with us before, just kind of sit back, and I'm sure it'll prove intuitive in just a moment. But let's pray the Lord's Prayer together, and then we'll jump into that. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.